I wasn't supposed to be there that morning. Honestly, if my connecting flight from Edinburgh hadn't been delayed by 3 hours, I'd have been halfway to Heathrow by the time any of this happened. But delays have a funny way of dropping you exactly where you need to be. And that Tuesday morning in late October, with the fog still clinging to the iron gates of Buckingham Palace like it didn't want to let go, I was standing maybe 40 feet from something that still makes the back of my neck prickle when I think about it. Let me back up. The honestly crowd that morning was the usual London mix. Tourists with their cameras up before they even found a good spot. A few school groups trailing teachers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Oh, some joggers cutting through the outer edge of the plaza because joggers in London treat every landmark like a personal obstacle course. The sky, well, was that particular shade of gray that London does better than anywhere in the world. Not quite raining. Not quite not raining. Just present, like the city itself was watching. I'd a TBH, coffee from the little cart near the Victoria Memorial. Terrible coffee, if I'm being honest. The kind that burns your throat and tastes like hot water made a poor decision. But it was something warm to hold, and the morning air had. That autumn bite to it. The kind that reminds you your jacket is never quite thick enough. The changing of the guard wasn't scheduled for another 40 minutes. So the crowd was the early kind. The ones who wanted the good spots. And the ones who'd read the tourist guides the night before and set alarms. There were maybe 200 people pressed along the outer areas, phones already raised, already recording nothing in particular, just so they'd be ready. I noticed her before most people did. Not because I knew who she was. Not at first, but because there's a specific kind of energy that certain people carry into a space, the kind. That makes the air shift slightly, that makes your eye travel across a crowd, and stop. She was walking with 3 other people, 2 men in dark suits who had that unmistakable posture of people who are professionally alert, and a woman in a gray coat carrying a leather portfolio. They weren't rushing exactly, but they moved with direction. Everyone else in that plaza was drifting. These, to be fair, 4 had a destination. She was young. That was, I guess, the first thing I registered. Younger than you'd expect for someone with that kind of composure. Blonde hair, neat but not fussy, wearing a navy coat that looked like it cost more than my rent, and a pair of heels that were making absolutely no complaint about the cobblestones. She had that Washington, D.C. look. I've been enough times to recognize it. That particular way of carrying yourself that says I'm always in a meeting, even when I'm not in a meeting. Someone sort of near me, a man with a German accent and a camera that had about 7 different lenses attached to it, said something to his wife, and she said back, "Isn't that the—" And then they were looking at their phones, squinting, comparing. I still, TBH, didn't put it together. Plus, for what it's worth, what I was watching instead was the guard. There are always guards at Buckingham Palace. That's obvious. But there's a difference between watching them on video and being 40 feet away from one in person. The stillness is something the camera doesn't capture properly. It's not just that they're not moving. It's that they seem to exist in a different category of being than the rest of us. The tourists fidget, I think, shift weight, check. Their phones, sneeze, argue about where to stand. The guard simply is, motionless, facing forward, as if he was there before the crowd arrived and would be there after they all went home. This one was young. I could tell, in my opinion, even under the bearskin hat. There was something about the set of his jaw, the smoothness of his face above the chin strap. He couldn't have been more than 22, 23. But he stood sort of, like he was carved. Look, red tunic perfectly pressed, white gloves, rifle held at a precise angle that probably had a name and a measurement attached to it that I don't know. The crowd was doing what crowds do, taking photos, getting too close, laughing when children mimicked the stance. The guard didn't blink. Then the small group of 4 reached the outer edge of the viewing area, and one of the suited men spoke briefly to someone. A palace liaison, I think. One of those quietly efficient people in dark coats who materialize out of nowhere at these events. There was a brief exchange, and the liaison nodded, gestured, and the small group was guided slightly forward to a position closer than the general public is usually allowed. And that's when the murmur started going through the crowd. The German couple had figured it out. So had a few others. Phones were coming up differently now. Not the casual tourist angle shots, but that deliberate angled-at-a-person framing that means someone recognizable has entered the frame. "That's, Karoline Leavitt," a woman behind me said to her friend, not quite whispering. "The White House press secretary, American." And it clicked, and I'd seen her on news clips, on the kind of brief video segments that play between other things you're actually watching. She had that quality of looking slightly more real in person than on screen, which is rarer than you'd think. Most people are the reverse. What happened next unfolded across maybe 4 minutes, but I've thought about it long enough that it feels much longer in the memory. In my opinion, way significant things do. The liaison was explaining something to her, gesturing toward the guard post, the routine of the changing ceremony, the standard information they give to visiting dignitaries who express interest in the tradition. She was listening, I think, nodding, the professional attentiveness of someone who processes information quickly. One of her suited companions was writing something in a small notebook. Then she said something to the liaison, which I couldn't hear it. I'm 40 feet away. There's ambient crowd noise, pigeons, a bus on the road behind the memorial. But I could read the body language clearly enough. She was asking something. The liaison's expression shifted, not dramatically, not rudely. But the way a person's face shifts when a question lands just slightly outside the expected parameters, the liaison responded. Karoline Leavitt responded, actually, to that, and there was a brief back and forth. And then, and this is the part that made 200 people go quiet before they even fully understood what they were watching. She turned toward the guard, and with that same composed, matter-of-fact energy, she said something in his direction. Not rude, not aggressive. The tone, from what I could piece together from people around me who were closer, was almost conversational. Direct. The kind of direct that comes from being used to rooms where your words carry weight. She had, from what filtered through the crowd in the next 30 seconds, people whispering to people. Asked the guard to acknowledge her, to salute, and to offer some kind of visible recognition of her presence as a representative of the United States government. The suited man with the notebook had stopped writing. The liaison had gone very still. The crowd, 200 people, cameras raised, coffee cups frozen halfway to lips, held its breath. And the guard didn't thing, and not dismissively, not rudely. He simply continued to be exactly what he was, motionless, rifle at the precise angle, eyes forward, the bearskin hat unmoving, the white-gloved hands without so much as a flicker, as if the request hadn't been made, as if the air itself had absorbed the words and found them insufficient reason to disturb anything. 30 seconds passed. I counted. Roughly. It felt like longer. Then Karoline Leavitt, I think, said something else. I couldn't catch it. But the person standing directly behind me, a British woman, 60s, sensible shoes, the kind of person who has strong opinions about queue jumping, muttered under her breath, "Oh, she's asking again." And the guard, still without moving anything else, without turning his head, without any change in posture or expression, spoke. 7 words, and I heard them clearly, because in that strange collective silence that had fallen over 200 tourists on a foggy October morning, his voice carried the way voices carry when everything else has decided to shut up. 7 words, and Buckingham Palace, or rather the small world of people standing in front of it, went absolutely, completely, unforgettably silent. Before I tell you what he said, I need you to understand something about what it feels like to watch a royal guard hold position. I think, no, it sounds like something you can explain easily. They're trained not to move. They don't respond to the public. It's a famous thing. Everyone knows it. Everyone's seen the videos of tourists making faces 2 inches from their noses, trying to crack a smile, failing. It's almost a game at this point, and a tourist sport. You see how close you can get to rattling them. But what I witnessed that morning wasn't a tourist trying to get a reaction for a laugh. And I mean, it wasn't a game. There was real weight to it. Real protocol on one side, real authority on the other, or at least what was presenting itself as authority. The White House press secretary isn't nobody. She speaks at the podium in the Brady briefing room with the cameras of every major news network in the world pointed at her face. She fields questions from people who have spent their careers trying to find the crack in whatever story the administration is telling. She's in the architecture of American political power, someone who does not get ignored. And this young man, this 22-year-old in a bearskin hat on a cold October morning, had ignored her completely, with a stillness so absolute it was almost philosophical. The crowd knew they were watching something. The phones had changed angle. People who had been filming the general area of the gates were now pointed basically at the guard, at the small group, at the space between them. The German man with all the camera lenses had crouched slightly, and the way photographers do when they feel something is about to resolve into a picture. The palace liaison, had taken a small step to the side, not retreating, but repositioning, the way someone does when they want to be useful, but also want to be slightly out of the frame of whatever is about to happen. Now, I want to be careful here, because what I can tell you with certainty is what I personally witnessed, and what I heard, and what the people around me confirmed hearing. Look, I'm not a journalist. I'd no recording device pointed at the exchange. My phone was in my pocket, which I now regret with the specific anguish of someone who missed a shot. I'd been drinking my terrible coffee and watching a gray London morning because my flight was delayed. Not because I expected anything worth documenting. But I was there, and I heard the words. "What look," Karoline Leavitt said. The second time, the ask that came after the first silence, was something along the lines of acknowledging her role, her government position, expressing that a gesture of recognition would be appropriate given her official status as a representative of the United States. Someone near me who caught more of it said she'd mentioned the diplomatic relationship between the countries, the alliance, the tradition of mutual respect between American officials and British institutions. It, in my opinion, wasn't a demand, exactly. It was framed, from what filtered back through the crowd, as a reasonable expectation, a professional courtesy. The guard's response was not unreasonable either. It was simply the truth. Well, plus 7 words. He said, "I serve the crown, and not foreign officials." That was it. No hostility in the voice, no contempt, which no triumph. He wasn't being cruel or smug about it. You just have to understand that. His voice was, I think, the same flat, formal register that the ceremony itself operates in. It was the voice of function, of duty stated plainly, because there was no other kind of statement available to him. I serve the basically crown, not foreign officials, and the words went through that crowd the way cold water goes through cloth, immediately, completely, leaving nothing dry. For a moment, and I mean this, it was real. You could feel the air change. Nobody spoke. Not the tourists, not the school children, not the woman behind me with the sensible shoes who had been muttering commentary. The pigeons, I swear, briefly suspended their opinions. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from people deciding to be quiet. It comes from people being made quiet by something they didn't expect to encounter on an otherwise ordinary morning. And then, one by one, the reactions came. The British woman behind me exhaled through her nose. A small sound, but it had an entire essay in it. The kind of exhale that says quite right without saying anything at all. The German man with the cameras said something to his wife in German that I didn't catch. The way he said it, with that rising inflection of someone confirming a suspicion, made it clear he approved. A teenager to my left, American from the accent, said, "Oh my God," to no one in particular, with the specific energy of someone who has just witnessed an unexpected plot development in a show they were only half watching. And Karoline Leavitt stood there. To actually her credit, and I mean this genuinely because what followed said something about her too. She didn't react badly. She didn't flush. To be fair, she didn't argue. There was a moment where her expression shifted, not into anger, but into something more controlled, more internal. The look of a person recalibrating very quickly, in real time, because their mental model of how a moment was going to go has just been replaced by a different model. She said TBH, something to her liaison, quietly. The liaison responded just as quietly. Then she turned and she looked at the guard, really looked at him, for maybe 3 seconds. Not with anger. More, I mean like the way you look at something that has surprised you and that you're now trying to understand. The guard remained exactly as he had been. She nodded once. To no one in particular, or possibly to herself, or possibly to the guard, it was impossible to say. Then she turned back to her small group and said something that made the suited man close his book. They didn't leave immediately. That's the part I want to make clear, because it would be easy to characterize this as a humiliation and a retreat, and that would be unfair and also inaccurate. They stood there for another 10 minutes or so. She watched the beginning preparations for the changing ceremony with what looked like genuine interest. She asked the liaison something. I could see the liaison answering at some length, pointing at different parts of the gates, the guardhouse, explaining the history probably, the ritual. She took it in. She was professional. She was composed, and she was doing the thing that anyone who operates at a high level in any field has to learn how to do, which is to take the moment that didn't go the way you expected and fold it into the rest of the morning without making it the only thing the morning was about. But the crowd didn't move on as easily. The story was already circulating within those 200 people in real time. I could see it spreading, the way people leaned to each other, the hushed retelling, the phones coming out to find who she was if they didn't already know, then lifting again to capture the guard still standing there in his perfect stillness, unchanged by anything. The British woman behind me said to her companion, "Good lad. Just that, good lad." Not 2 words carrying the weight of an entire culture's particular pride in a particular kind of integrity. I've thought a lot in the weeks since about why those 7 words hit the way they did. Part of it's the simplicity. I honestly serve the crown, not foreign officials. There's no insult in it. No nationalism, no rudeness, no score settling. It's just a statement of what's true. Clean and precise as a pin dropping in a quiet room. Part of it's the context and the entire architecture of those guards, the ceremony, the uniform, the training, the absolute discipline of the stillness is designed to communicate something about continuity, about the fact that some things don't bend to the immediate pressure of whoever is currently standing in front of them. The guard isn't making a political statement. He is being exactly what he was trained to be, in exactly the circumstances his training was designed for. And part of it, the human part, the part that made 200 strangers go silent on a foggy morning, is that we don't expect it. We live in a world where almost everything bends, where titles and offices and the weight of official status are generally enough to move people, to shift responses, to generate deference. The whole machinery of diplomacy, of political power, of institutional prestige runs, partly on the assumption that when you show your credentials, the door opens. The guard didn't have a door, which he had a post, and you cannot show your credentials to a post. I stayed until the changing ceremony proper began. The crowd had, grown to its full size by then. Maybe 400 or 500 people, are pressed against the barriers, phones up, the whole familiar spectacle. Karoline T.B.H. Leavitt and her group had repositioned slightly, watching from a better angle. And at one point, I noticed this because I was watching her more than the ceremony, the guard from earlier was replaced by one of the new guards in the ceremony's rotation. He marched to his position with that particular precision, the kind that makes you aware of every millimeter of movement, and took his post. Karoline Leavitt watched him, and for just a moment, before the ceremony's next beat drew everyone's attention forward, she smiled. To be fair, not at anything specific. For what it's worth, not at anyone. Just a small smile, the kind that lands when something has settled into understanding. I don't know what she was thinking. I can only say what it looked like. It looked, for what it's worth, like respect. Here's the thing about moments that go sideways. Most of the time, when something doesn't go the way a person expects, especially someone in a high-profile position, especially in public, the immediate response is to try to undo the moment, reframe it, which spin it, get ahead of whatever the story is going to be. It's practically instinct at a certain level of public life. You develop this reflexive management of narrative because that's how you survive in an environment TBH, where every bad moment gets cut into a clip and run on a loop. What I actually observed standing on that plaza with my terrible coffee going cold in my hand was something slightly different. I watched a person absorb something unexpected and then choose, visibly, consciously, not to fight it. That impressed me. Look, I've my own politics. We all do. That's not what this is about. What I'm describing is something more basic than politics, something that exists in the territory before you get to who votes for what and why. I'm describing a person who got a piece of reality delivered to them plainly, without cushioning, in front of an audience, and who found the self-possession to take it without crumbling or lashing out. I think that's not nothing. The ceremony continued. The guards rotated with their clockwork precision. The crowd took their photos, oohed at the right moments, complained about not being able to see. A child near me sat on her father's shoulders and kept asking if the bears on the hats were real bears, and her father kept saying, "No, they're not real bears," and she kept not believing him. The fog burned off slowly, and the way London fog does, reluctantly, leaving a sky that wasn't quite gray anymore, but wasn't committing to blue either. Karoline Leavitt watched, the whole thing. I kept expecting her group to leave. They never did, not before I finally had to pull myself away to check my rescheduled flight status. They were still there when I last looked back, the suited men standing a pace behind, the woman with the leather portfolio at her side, all of them watching a ceremony that has been performed with almost no variation for centuries. I talked to a woman afterwards, British, probably in her 50s, with the easy confidence of someone who has lived in London long enough to feel personally responsible for it. Her name was Patricia. She told me unprompted, the way friendly strangers do. She had been there for the whole thing, and closer than I was, off to the left near the memorial. She, in my opinion, said she'd heard the 7 words clearly. I actually wrote them down, she told me, and pulled out her phone to show me. She'd typed them into her notes app almost immediately after. The way you'd save a piece of dialogue you didn't want to forget. I serve the Crown, not foreign officials, which exactly as I'd heard them. What do you make of it? I asked her. She thought about it for a moment. Really thought, not one of those reflexive, already formed answers that people often give. She looked back toward the gates. It's not about her, really, she said finally. It would have kind of been the same answer for anyone. The French foreign minister, pretty much the German chancellor, anyone. That's the whole point of it, isn't it? The answer doesn't change depending on who's asking. She paused. That's actually quite rare, she said. An answer that doesn't change depending on who's asking. I thought about that for a long time afterwards. Honestly, she's right, of course. The guard wasn't making a statement about America. He wasn't making a statement about the current administration, or about Karoline Leavitt specifically, or about Anglo-American relations, or about any of the things that would inevitably get stitched onto the moment once the story made its way onto the internet, which it was already doing. I could see people editing their videos as they walked away, already typing captions. He was like making a statement about function, about what he was and wasn't. I serve the crown, not this government, not the last one, not the next one, not the government of any country, ally or not. The crown, the specific, for what it's worth, ancient, very particular thing he had taken an oath to. Not foreign officials, not rudely, not dismissively, just accurately. You are a foreign official. I don't serve foreign officials. Plus, these are two true things that exist in relation to each other without malice. 7, words that are basically just a job description. And for what it's worth somehow, in that particular moment, on that particular morning, they landed like something much larger. I've tried to figure out why, and I think it comes down to this. We spend a lot of time, collectively, being surprised when things don't hold. When institutions bend, when the people who are supposed to hold a line find a reason to step aside. That when authority turns out to be more negotiable than its stated terms, when the uniform doesn't actually mean what the uniform is supposed to mean, we've become so accustomed to watching things give way, to pressure, to money, to status, to whoever is currently in the room with the most tap into, that when something simply doesn't give way, it catches us completely off guard. That guard wasn't being dramatic. He wasn't performing virtue. Plus, he wasn't making a point. He was just doing the thing he was trained and sworn to do, which was to stand at that post and be exactly what he was, regardless of who was in front of him. The silence that fell over that crowd wasn't reverence exactly. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even entirely about the specific political dimension, though the internet would certainly frame it that way later. It was the silence of people recognizing something they hadn't expected to see on a Tuesday morning. Integrity without audience. The thing that doesn't change when someone important is watching. My flight eventually left. I was in a window seat and I watched London fall away beneath the clouds. The Thames doing its grey winding thing, the dome of St. Paul's, the clusters of towers, all of it shrinking into the kind of toy-like scale that reminds you of how much history is compressed into a very small island. I guess, thought about the guard. I thought about, look, the fact that right now, at this moment, as I'm looking at the city from above, there's probably another guard standing at that same post, same position, same stillness, plus different young man inside the uniform, but the function identical. At the answer to any equivalent, question identical. I serve the crown, not foreign officials. There's something almost restful about that, in a strange way. In a world where almost everything is subject to renegotiation, where almost every boundary is provisional, where almost every no eventually becomes a maybe, there are these small, stubborn pockets of the thing that simply stays put. They're not glamorous, they're not complicated, they just stand there and don't bend. The story spread the way stories spread now. Fast, fragmented, with each platform giving it a slightly different shape. Some versions made it purely political. Some made it about Anglo-American relations, which some made the guard a hero. Some made the whole thing a diplomatic incident. Some questioned whether it even happened the way it was being described. Patricia from the memorial texted a friend in Manchester who texted someone else. The German man's footage ended up somewhere. A clip circulated, with the audio partially unclear, but the body language unmistakable. Comment sections did what comment sections do, which is to have 19 different conversations simultaneously, most of them adjacent to the actual event. I didn't post anything. Plus, I'm not entirely sure why. Part of it, sort of, was that I didn't have footage. just the memory of standing there with cold coffee in my hand, watching something happen. Part of it was that I didn't trust the internet to hold the moment the way it actually felt, which was smaller and quieter and more human than any of the political framings would allow. There's a version of this story where the Guard is a hero defending British sovereignty. There's a version where Karoline Leavitt made an unreasonable request that deserved exactly the response she got. There's a version, I guess, where the whole thing was a minor diplomatic awkwardness that everyone involved moved past inside 10 minutes, which is probably closer to the practical truth. But the version I keep coming back to is the one I actually saw. A young man standing in a cold, foggy morning in one of the most famous public spaces in the world, doing his job exactly as his job is defined, for no audience and every audience at once. 7 words when pretty much 7 words were the right amount of words. And then silence. And then the ceremony continuing, as it's continued as it will continue, through every political moment and every visiting official. Every tourist and look, every foggy October morning, or long past the point when anyone remembers who was standing in front of the gates on this particular Tuesday. I told a colleague about it when I got back. She asked me what the takeaway was, and I thought about it for a second. I think, I said, it's that some things aren't about you. No matter how important look, some things just aren't about you. She considered that. That sounds simple, she said. It is simple, I said. That's the whole point. Oh, and outside Buckingham Palace right now there's a guard at the post. He isn't thinking about that morning. He probably doesn't think much about any specific morning. The mornings blur together in the way that any routine blurs. The ritual. Absorbing kind of each individual instance until what remains is just the function, the purpose, the oath. He is standing there. And he will still be standing there after every headline has been forgotten, after every clip has been buried under newer clips, after every political moment has been replaced by the next political moment, facing forward, basically serving what he serves. That is, if you think about it long enough, one of the quieter and more stubborn forms of dignity the world has left.